denounce that murder and that assassination. And I was so heartened to see that all of our former living presidents all spoke out in deeply passionate terms. George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. And they urged us to rely, as Lincoln urged us, in our greatest conflict, on the better angels of our nature. And to see past the red-blue divisions in this society and to unite as Americans. Political violence against the right, or political violence against Melissa Hortman, a state senator from Minnesota, killed with her husband at her front door 3 months ago. She was part of our community. She was a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School, where I am now teaching. And so whether it's violence against a conservative figure or a progressive figure or a centrist or anybody, it's inadmissible. It's unworthy of a great nation. And I hope that we can proceed in that basis. I was thinking this morning about April 4th, 1968. I was 12. I was at Perrin School, a sixth grader in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I had an enlightened teacher, Mrs. Barton, who urged us to understand the life of Martin Luther King and the need at that time to close another divide between African Americans and white Americans. And so I remember that Robert Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, had gone into a black neighborhood in Indianapolis that night because the fear was that America was going to be lit on fire by the assassination of someone who I think is the greatest American of the last half century, and more than that. That's Martin Luther King. Here's what Senator Kennedy said that night, which I think has resonance for us today. He said, "It's not the end of the violence. It's not the end of lawlessness. And it is not the end of disorder. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world." And he said, let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and say a prayer for our people. Fitting words from 1968 that might help us both understand what's happened to our country and what we need to do to unite it. Mary and I were talking backstage about what this means for us as a global power. We, I think, cannot be successful as a model for the democratic world if we do not put some of the violence, all of the violence, and the red-blue divide behind us. And so we'll talk about that as well tonight. Finally, there's another auspicious part of today. It was a beautiful day today, and reminiscent of what started off as a beautiful sunny day on September 11th, 2001. And all of us who are Bostonians remember that 2 of the planes involved in the attack by Al-Qaeda took off from Logan Airport. I was not here. I was American ambassador to NATO in Brussels, Belgium. We were 6 hours ahead of the East Coast, and when we heard about the attacks, my team and I of military and officers and diplomats gathered together, and we tried to call the White House, and the White House had been evacuated because there was a fear of an attack on Washington. Of course, the Pentagon had been attacked. The State Department had been evacuated. The Defense Department had been evacuated. And we didn't know if the attack would hit American military installations around the world. And so I couldn't reach anyone. But my phone rang. And it was a guy named David Wright, who was the Canadian ambassador to NATO. And David said, "Nick, have you thought about invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty in response to what al-Qaeda, he knew and I knew it was al-Qaeda, have done. Now, Article 5 of our treaty from 1949 basically says if one of us is attacked, it shall be considered that all of us are attacked. That was written and agreed to by President Harry Truman because he feared, and Europe feared in April 1949, that Stalin would attack Western Europe and we'd be involved in a Third World War. And the Allies, when they formed NATO, wanted to be assured that Canada and the United States would come a third time in the 20th century to defend Europe. What a huge irony it was for me and my team that day, that actually Europe and Canada came to our rescue that day. And what's very meaningful about it is that when all the NATO nations had decided they would invoke Article 5, the next morning, September 12th, I figured I needed presidential guidance and instruction, because we knew this meant that we'd have to go into Afghanistan in a war. And so I called my closest friend at that point in the White House, Condoleezza Rice. I had worked for her before. She was the National Security Advisor. It was 4 in the morning. I said, Condi, the Allies want to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. I said, thank you, Condi, for your sentiment. I think I need the president's personal instruction to vote for Article 5. She said, go for it. And I tried a third time. I said, Condi. She said, Nick, he's had a really bad day. He's trying to get some sleep. Go for it. I said, I'll take that, Condi. You're the National Security Advisor, as my presidential instruction. And I'm going to head down to our central room and I'm going to vote on behalf of the United States. We're going to go to war with al-Qaeda. She said one more thing. And I've always remembered what she said. She said, it's good to have friends in the world. And boy, have I thought about that. Many times over the course of the years, but particularly this year, I thought about it when people in the administration began to attack the sovereignty of Canada. It was Canada who decided to lead the parade to assist the United States. It was Denmark also attacked the sovereignty of Denmark right behind them. And I think the biggest takeaway of my entire career, dating back to 1980 as a diplomat, but certainly the time when Libby and I were living in China, is we're a powerful country. Thank goodness for that. Our military power, our diplomatic power, our technology power of the 21st century. But if we are to create, as Robert Kennedy said, a better world, a more peaceful world, a world where democracy can thrive, we need friends in the world. You saw that parade last week in Beijing on September 3rd. You saw that axis of authoritarian leaders, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, the president of Iran. They don't want a democratic world. They don't want a world where women's rights are respected, or civil freedoms and press freedoms are respected. But we want that world. And so the takeaway here for our discussion tonight, particularly when we talk about our extraordinarily competitive relationship with China, is when we have Japan and Korea and the Philippines and Australia, all treaty allies, working with us. When we have India, our great strategic partner, working with us. When we have NATO working with us, we outweigh and can out-leverage Putin and Xi Jinping. But if we're not good to our allies, if we're not respectful of our allies, we lose and we're less affected. I can't think of a more important message for the American people and for all of us as citizens as we continue to think about America's role in the world. Thank you very much.
We have a little bit to talk about. My
do.
goodness. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you again for being with us. What we thought which makes sense is to sort of start with China, and then we'll go to the rest of the world. As ambassador, you were the president's personal representative in China, managing, optimizing the most important bilateral relationship in the world right now.
Not for the faint of heart.
Not for the faint of heart. You have many times talked about how this is not exactly a we're not in a Cold War. It's not exactly a rivalry. It's a competition. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what you mean by that and what arenas the competition is taking place in.
Thank you. So Libby and I were living in China, representing our country. And I think there's no question that as we look out on the world, we've got lots of challenges. I mentioned some of them. But China is the strongest adversary we have in the world. We're the two largest economies, and we have almost irreconcilable differences between us on trade and on tariffs. We're the two strongest militaries. We're the only two countries, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant to any non-American here, but I think we're the only two countries with true global reach we can affect because of the economic power, the cultural power of both China and the United States have an impact on the rest of the world. I think we're structural rivals. No matter who's in the White House, and I think no matter probably who's in Zhongnanhai, which is where the Chinese leadership lives near the Forbidden City in Beijing, this rivalry is going to continue into the 2030s and the 2040s. There's an established power since 1945, the United States. There's a rising power with a completely different, and here's one of the big differences, value system. We believe in human freedom. We're not perfect, but we believe in democracy and the rule of the people. The Communist Party of China believes in the rule of the Communist Party of China. It is an extraordinarily repressive authoritarian regime. It's more repressive now than it was the day Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. And so the biggest difference is that difference over how we want people to be treated and the rights that people have in our society. That's one difference. Second difference, we are with our allies, particularly the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, and the Indians. If you think about the Indo-Pacific from, I wish I had brought a map, from the Persian Gulf all the way across the Arabian Sea, the subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, the Western Pacific, and the Pacific Ocean states, island states, we are by far, the United States Navy and Air Force, the supreme power. China's trying to knock us off as the #1 military power. The rise of the PLA, the biggest buildup of military power in the world in the last 20 years has been the People's Liberation Army. biggest buildup of nuclear weapons in the world is the People's Liberation Army. Their design and aim is to make us the #2 military power in 10 to 15 years' time and make themselves the largest power. That will change the Pacific and Asia forever in a bad way if it happens. That's a second arena of competition. A third is technology. And, I think it's moved to center stage because of this transformative technology, artificial intelligence. There is an extraordinary competition between the American tech companies and the Chinese tech companies, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba. I visited all of them, know their leadership. And they want to be first mover and first adapter of both artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. And, this is a very different battle than the old Cold War. If you think about the nuclear weapons competition, think of Eisenhower and Kennedy and Reagan. Those were technologies controlled by governments, produced by governments, and this is a very different competition. Governments don't have real competence in AI, but our tech companies do. So it's the American tech companies versus the Chinese tech companies. Americans assisted by the Japanese and the Germans and the British, our allies. And whoever wins the battle to be dominant in that technology as an originator and adapter is going to be the supreme economic power for the next 30 or 40 years. We've got to win. And President Trump has taken the position to very lightly regulate our AI sector right now because he wants us to win. I think Trump's right about that, by the way. So that's another big battle. And finally is trade and tariffs. Now, I didn't support 145% tariffs, and China responded with 125, but frankly, China has played by the rules. I spoke to nearly every CEO, American CEO came to China. I spent a lot of time with the business community. Intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, the market access, the lack of a level playing field for American business, and we have thousands of businesses in a $642 billion two-way trade relationship. Our firms are lucky to be profitable. So President Trump's very aggressive tariffs against China, I actually think are appropriate in this instance, and they've gotten the attention of Xi Jinping. I also think there's probably going to be a trade deal. Probably in the next 2 months, that's going to be a good thing for China and the United States. The mistake, I think, and I'll finish on this, Mary, is by President Trump, is that I thought it was appropriate to go after the Chinese, but he simultaneously put high tariffs on all of our allies, on Japan, on South Korea, 50% tariffs on India, maybe the most important military strategic partner that we have in the Pacific, and of course going after Canada, Mexico, and the EU. This really took away the leverage we should have because all those countries have the same problems with China that we do. But if you put tariffs on them that are equal to or even exceeding the tariffs on China, they didn't have the wish to work with us. So it's this very complicated relationship. But I think those are the 4 areas: human rights, military competition, tech competition, economic competition. And that is going to be, I think, what we're going to have to live with. How do we manage the competition so that it doesn't descend into conflict? And that was the instruction I had from President Biden. Compete with China, but we have to live in peace with China. And we have to find issues like climate change, fentanyl, where we can work together with China. It's a lot more complex than just this very quick tour of the relationship, but it's quite a relationship.
Thank you. So many sub-questions about that. But, we can go back to, China joining the WTO, China shock, et cetera. As you have said, so these problems in the business arena of the competition have existed for a long time. And you, I think, see a good deal of continuity in our assessment of the threat from previous administrations, from the administration that you represented, to, it sounds like, how you look at Trump's response to China, not to the allies.
Well, it's interesting. If you think about the red-blue divide, the ideological divide in the United States, Republicans and Democrats on most days can't agree that the sky is blue. But if you ask them about China, there's remarkable similarity of views among the Republican Party and Democratic Party leadership. It's not completely identical. Democrats have believed that climate change is real. that the science is more than legitimate. It's an existential threat. We got to work with China. China's the largest emitter of carbon. We're number two. So in the last 4 years, I worked very closely with John Kerry and then John Podesta. They were the two climate negotiators, and we really felt that we had to work with China on this. President Trump has disavowed that, which I think is a major, major mistake. But with that,
Disavowed climate cooperation.
yeah, President Trump has taken us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He's taken us out of any work with China or the EU or Japan or India, the other large emitters of carbon, and this is going to set the world back. And so with that exception, it's interesting. I think Joe Biden and Donald Trump, if you had them on the stage tonight, they probably wouldn't say, they have identical policies. But I was out there. We implemented all of the Trump tariffs from 2020 on China because we felt they were right as a way to pressure the Chinese. Joe Biden actually put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, electric vehicles, 50% on semiconductors, 25% on lithium batteries. He actually upped the ante, and at least until now, President Trump has maintained the Biden tariffs on China. Why have we done this? Because I think it's pretty clear now, and economists have done the modeling, that between the late 1990s and about 2010, we lost between 1.5 to 2 million American jobs because of unfair competition, manufactured exports from China, sold below the cost of production and designed to kill American companies. And, if you go to Fall River, if you go to New Bedford, if you go to Lowell, if you go to Fitchburg, if you go to Springfield, Claremont, New Hampshire, where Libby and I were just a couple of weeks ago, you see a lot of hollowed out downtowns. And those downtowns were once thriving. And it's very interesting over the last year. It's not just Donald Trump and Joe Biden who have raised this issue. Who's put tariffs on China in the last 12 months? Fascinating. India, Turkey, South Africa, a very close friend of China, Brazil, another close friend of China, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and the United States of America. The Chinese are manufacturing 2 to 3 times domestic demand, what they can sell in their own country, and they're exporting it below the cost of production in robotics, in steel, in EVs, in semiconductors, lots of categories, and they're out to kill the producers in those countries and achieve market share. And, the first responsibility of government is protect our economy, protect our countries. So I actually see a united front from the two political parties in our country. And I'm talking to senators and members of the House. It's pretty clear we have a strategy that is agreed to. So I really hope President Trump can succeed here.
Okay. But at the same time, we can't deal ourselves out by making trade with our actual allies.
Exactly.
So punitive. I mean, I'm not saying that, but it sounds like that's the reasoning.
I think President Trump has reduced his potential effectiveness to leverage Xi Jinping, because he should have Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, and the Japanese prime minister and the Korean president with them. But if you're exacting high tariffs on them, look what happened in the state of Georgia, too. The ICE incident at the South Korean plant there's a lot of unhappiness in allied capitals that we're not treating them well, which is why I felt I had to raise the issue of 9/11, how much we owe our allies.
And yes, okay. So, wow, there's so much more to talk about. So I would love to go into more detail, but in a competition, I didn't think you were going to say rivalry, but okay, a rivalry. Someone is winning and losing. Certain aspects or arenas of the competition are more important. You look behind to see how the guy back there is doing, or how much you have to go to catch up. Essentially, how are we doing? Who's ahead? And how do you know when you get there?
Xi Jinping began to say publicly as early as 2020, the East is rising, and the West is falling. And in all of my time in China, I met, of course, the entire leadership, spent a lot of time with Xi Jinping and his cabinet. We went to, Libby and I, 26 provinces, met governors, met Communist Party secretaries, professors, business people. I think in general, I have two observations. One is many in the Chinese elite believe that the United States is a fading power. They point to our dysfunctional political system and political reality in Washington. They point to our sagging infrastructure, although President Biden and the Congress, both parties were able to pass a $1 trillion bill, and let's hope we can rebuild the infrastructure of our country. I spent all my time trying to disavow them, disavow that sentiment, and convince them we're not dying. And one of the ways that I tried to do that was on social media and public diplomacy. But on Weibo and WeChat, there are hundreds of millions of Chinese on those social media platforms to wage what we call the battle of ideas. You think we're a country of the past? We believe in human freedom, we believe in human rights, and we went after the Chinese on Tibet, on Xinjiang, the mistreatment of the Uyghur population. I was just in Hong Kong this past week, and what's happened to Hong Kong and the national security law that's extinguished the political rights of the people of Hong Kong. And so we went on the offensive because they were after us to say, actually, we're not a country of the past. We have a big future. We have self-confidence in our system of government. And so it was a very combative relationship. And they used the power of the press to attack me and attack President Biden, but that's part of this push and pull in this relationship.
Thank you. So you're actually anticipating something that I wanted to ask about. How public diplomacy, or does public diplomacy actually matter? Of course, at World Boston, in our way, we engage in it. We, of course, are a big host of the International Visitors Leadership Program, so we think it's important. But is it really? Are the Chinese taking, for example, the challenge of public diplomacy seriously?
Very
seriously. Just for fun? We like the exchanges.
So unfortunately, if you think about the natural advantage that a democratic society like the United States, think of Hollywood, think of our IT system we should have, we're way behind the Chinese. They have CCTV and CGTN. If you go to any hotel room in the world, you're going to get a Chinese government broadcasting station spewing out a lot of misinformation about us and a lot of misinformation about their model democracy. They call themselves a whole process democracy. What have we done? Well, Elon Musk and the Doge team destroyed the Voice of America, dismantled it, fired everybody. That was created back in the Truman administration to combat the the battle of ideas we had with the Soviet Union. We figured there were about 300 million Chinese listening behind their firewall. They can't get Google, there's no free internet, they live in a closed environment, 1.4 billion people, but Voice of America got in, and Radio Free Asia got in, and both have been dismantled by the Trump administration. This doesn't make any sense. It leaves us defenseless. It leaves the entire platform to China. I'll give you one example. The Indonesian government has a good relationship with both China and the US. So their state broadcaster, until about 2 months ago, gave an hour of time every week to Voice of America and an hour of time to CCTV, the Chinese state broadcaster. Well, we destroyed and dismantled Voice of America this past spring and summer. So that second hour, our hour, was given to the Chinese broadcaster. So in terms of our outreach to the rest of the world, to explain in 194 other nation states who we are, what we believe in, to give our side of the story, we've just emasculated ourselves. We have no more state capability in the US government, which we have had now for nearly 80 years, because President Trump and Elon Musk decided that it wasn't worthy. I'll give you another example. The Belt Road Initiative, I think you've all heard of that. The Chinese have put out about $1 trillion US to the rest of the world in loans and grants, particularly in the global south, since 2012. We had an organization called the U.S. Agency for International Development. It wasn't perfect, but it was doing a lot of good work. President George W. Bush, through PEPFAR, we were supplying vaccines and HIV treatment and saving not just millions of lives, tens of millions of lives through American assistance. USAID was dismantled in 8 days in February of this year. They actually took a blowtorch to the moniker of USAID above the building on Constitution Avenue. 8,000 people were fired summarily, friends of ours, colleagues of ours, in 1 week. I mean, you didn't go through the organization the way a normal manager would say, okay, where's the fat? Who's performing? Who's underperforming? Every government agency needs a lot of reform, constant reform. But to destroy it in 1 week and fire 8,500 people, it was just officially dismantled a couple of weeks ago. It has ceased to exist. And so China is out with its tremendous world-breaking, in terms of $1 trillion US program, and we have nothing going for ourselves. So here's the story to illustrate it. I flew into Lima, Peru last November 15th. After our election, President Trump had won, and President Biden was going to have his last summit meeting with President Xi Jinping. And when I landed, I read a New York Times article, front page that day, which had a graphic, and it showed South America. And the New York Times said in 2002, the United States was the leading trade partner of every country in South America. In 2024, China was the leading trade partner of every country except for Colombia in South America. And then I turned on my TV in Lima, and there was President Xi Jinping, who'd arrived a day before us, and he was dedicating a $3 billion port for the people of Peru that the Chinese people paid for. You have to admire their ambition, their strategic focus. They are out there trying to claim what you call in business market share, but allegiance. They want other countries to follow their model and follow them and choose them, not us. And we have now taken ourselves off the field with the destruction of USAID and Voice of America. Does that make sense for the American people? I asked the question.
All right. We're going to end on this portion on a question. I have so much more I would love to go into, but I'm sure you all have questions too. So let's leave it there for the moment and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for your excellent speech, Ambassador Barnes. And I want to ask a question. It's about as an American ambassador in China, how do you consider the Chinese true, their aiming, their target about international order? So we have seen that there's a lot of statement about that. Like in 2010, was Prime Secretary Hu Jintao was saying that the most greatest dream of Chinese people is to unite it. And then it's like they only want the sovereignty of Taiwan, and then they can stop. But in 2012, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, and later they have another system like the Community of Shared Future of Mankind and other.
So we're going to try and boil that down to the essence of your question, if that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we met coming in, didn't we? You're from Northeastern, and you were from Guangzhou, Canton. Yeah, Libby and I met Xi when we came into the library tonight. So thank you for the question. Thank you for being a student here. One of the things we haven't talked about is we have about 273,000 Chinese students in the United States. We in the Biden administration felt they are very welcome. We want Chinese students in our country. They contribute a lot to our universities. I've taught many Chinese students. I was very pleased when President Trump said 2 weeks ago, there were calls from some Republicans to kick out all the Chinese students. And President Trump said, I'd like to have 600,000 Chinese students. And so I agree with President Trump in that basis. On your question, Taiwan is probably the most serious issue in the relationship. It's certainly the most dangerous issue between us. The American position has been remarkably consistent and clear since President Nixon's trip to China in 1972. We believe there's one China, but we believe the dispute across the Strait of Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and the People's Republic has to be adjudicated, worked out peacefully. And so we have certainly not agreed, we've vociferously disagreed with the bellicose language from the government of China towards Taiwan. And we think the Chinese government should commit to a peaceful resolution of this dispute. We don't support the independence of Taiwan. No American president in 50 years has done that. But we do believe that that society has a right to be free, has a right to be democratic, has a right to practice the system they want to have. And so this is a much more, it's a much more complicated issue than that. But that is, in a nutshell, the policy of every American president from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump. And this does give me the opportunity also to say, we've addressed really the competitive part of this relationship. We were dedicated in the Biden administration to trying to find issues to work with China when our interests aligned. Talked about climate change. Fentanyl is a leading cause of death in our society of Americans 18 to 49. The majority of the precursor chemicals that make up the synthetic opioid come from the Chinese black market, not from the government of China, but from the black market. And President Biden and Senator Chuck Schumer and a bipartisan delegation of senators, when we went in to see President Xi in 2023, he agreed to help the United States. And he was true to his word. China began to work against the black market. We didn't think the government of China did enough, but it was a good start. And now President Trump is insisting that China go further, and I think he's right to do that. And so there's another issue where we can work with the Chinese government, fentanyl. Last issue would be we've had 4 pandemics since 2002, beginning with the SARS pandemic. And of course, we all lived through the coronavirus pandemic. Law of averages, we'll face another pandemic. I would hope that this time, as opposed to March 2020, our two countries with big public health capacity, we should work together and put aside our political differences. That was our sentiment in the Biden administration. And I do want to accentuate, we believe that war between China and the United States would be an absolute catastrophe. And we made every effort to drive down the probability of a war. And President Biden believed that we had to live together. I certainly passionately agreed to that. So this is a hard relationship to manage when your strongest competitor is also a country with which you have to live in peace. And that's the test of our diplomacy. Can we manage the competition, which is happening and will happen, in such a way that we don't drive it towards conflict? And I felt strongly that we succeeded in doing that in the Biden administration. And let's hope that President Trump can achieve the same result. So thank you. Thank you for being here in Boston.
So I'm going to break in with a question because it's so relevant to where you just were. Looking for indicators, landmarks, et cetera. There is a meeting between Xi and Trump coming up, probably.
I hope.
Probably.
Yeah.
So there's that to look for. What will you be looking for to accomplish or understand from that? And then in the in the near term, let's pick the 2026 elections as a near term. What are the key moments in the relationship that you're going to be looking for?
Well, I think first, I hope that President Trump and President Xi will be able to meet, because the Chinese system is now really a party of one. Xi Jinping is the unrivaled power. Deng Xiaoping's theory after Mao was that Mao's excesses during the Cultural Revolution nearly ruined China. So Deng said, we've got to have a committee of equals in the Standing Committee of the Politburo. That's what he practiced. President Xi Jinping, since 2012, has made it into an administration of one. So you really can't get anything done in terms of our big relationship with China on these major issues unless you're meeting with President Xi. And so President Trump had a pretty good relationship with him in his first term, and they want a meeting. And there's speculation, I don't know if it's going to happen, that there's an APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Conference meeting in Seoul, Korea at the end of October. Could they meet on the margins of that meeting? We'll see. But here's the kicker. The Chinese tradition is, when you have summit meetings, that everything is worked out before the two leaders walk in. So will Scott Bessent, our Treasury Secretary, and Vice Premier Hurley Feng be able to work out a new trade deal that would lower the tariffs between us and also look at some of the other problems in the economic relationship? If they can work that out, I think there probably will be a trade meeting. And since we're the number 1 and 2 economies in the world, we've got to hope that we can climb down from these stratospherically high tariff levels and try to work something out. Think about what's happened on tariffs since January. We began this calendar year with, I think, an effective tariff rate of 2.5%. We now have an effective tariff rate because of the President's Trump tariff policies of 18.6%. These are the highest tariff levels since Smoot-Hawley in 1931. And the great majority of economists in the United States would say that was a critical strategic mistake for President Herbert Hoover to put such high tariffs on our economy, and one of the principal reasons we ended up in a Great Depression. Now, let's hope that doesn't happen with our country. But I think, unfortunately, the Trump tariffs have completely made this a Wild West globally. The world of order that Truman and Eisenhower and JFK and Reagan created on tariffs, on the United Nations system, on a great power peace is gone. And I think, unfortunately, we are now entering a world of disorder, and the tariffs problem right now is a very good example of that. So I think that's the biggest impediment to a Xi Jinping-Trump summit, but both countries have an interest in not having these high tariffs. So let's see if they can succeed.
Hi, thanks very much. I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on Taiwan and what you think the prospects for a Chinese takeover of the island, and there's a variety of ways that might happen, and how U.S. policy can either help forestall that or not. And specifically, I guess what I'm looking at is when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it wasn't just the Ukrainians and the Europeans who were watching the U.S. response. It was China as well, presumably. And so, you know, when the Chinese look at Zelensky in the Oval Office being drubbed by you know, President Trump, and Marco Rubio was silent through all that. And when you see our allies being treated the way they are, how does that impact the Chinese perception of U.S. support for Taiwan?
Really good question. Thank you for making the link between China and what lessons it's drawing from the Ukraine conflict for Taiwan, because that's a big subject. I think that, first of all, the Chinese have told me in the spring of 22, we're completely neutral in this war, and I never believed it, and it's not true. The Chinese have been providing the major military support, microelectronics for the Russian defense industrial base to Moscow. And we've sanctioned the Biden and Trump administrations, I think, over 300 Chinese companies that are doing this. So that's point number one. Point number two, the Chinese are looking intently at Ukraine for two reasons. First, if Putin gets away with this crime, if we don't stand up to him, if the United States does not support Zelensky and support the Europeans who want to arm Zelensky, then I think Xi Jinping, I know the Chinese leadership, are going to look at that and say, well, if they weren't willing to support Ukraine in the heart of Europe, why would they support Taiwan? So they would draw the exact opposite lesson that we want them to draw. Second, the Taiwan Authority, the Taiwan government, has been very, very quick to understand what the Ukrainians have done well. A much smaller army has held off this gigantic Russian army and done just brilliantly, with great cost to their society, with all the people dead. But they've held off the Red Army, the Russian army. And so the Taiwanese are now undertaking a major campaign to become a drone power and to try to fashion a strategy that would negate the advantage of a cross-strait invasion by the PLA Navy and Air Force. So I think the Chinese are learning two lessons, one that really worries them, and that's the latter one. By the way, if you just think about the nature of warfare, we are witnessing a revolution in warfare. Drone technology is dominating the battle space. The Russians brutally launched the biggest attack of the war Sunday night, a drone attack on Kyiv and 10 other cities, and they're just trying to kill civilians to intimidate the Ukrainian population is
And
absolutely
went
brutal.
into NATO airspace with their drones.
They did.
As it is reported. I
And
don't
that
know
was not a mistake. And so it was very important. The first ever violation of NATO airspace since 1949 occurred 2 days ago, when the Russians flew drones, not just one or two off course, into the middle of Poland to intimidate the Poles and NATO. Every single NATO leader, from Mark Carney in Ottawa to all the European leaders, denounced it. We have not seen President Trump over the last couple of days to denounce it. He needs to get tougher on Putin. You know, President Trump has reached out to Putin. He's given him chance after chance over the last 8 months, particularly at Anchorage several weeks ago, and Putin has given nothing in return. He doesn't agree to a ceasefire, which everybody else wants. He thinks he can make further progress on the battlefield against Ukraine. And we've got to join with the Europeans and give them stronger support. We stopped providing arms to Ukraine. I think that was a major mistake, because if Putin wins this, what it will do, it'll divide Europe. An authoritarian East, a democratic West. Who remembers the old Cold War here? A lot of us of a certain age remember it. I was working for, Condi Rice and I were the two-person Soviet team for President H.W. Bush in the White House when the Cold War ended. And I'll never forget December 25th, 1991, Libby won't either. President Bush addressed the nation that night, and he said, we and the Poles and Pope John Paul II, the people of Eastern Europe, are victorious. In the Cold War, over 5 decades, the people of Europe liberated themselves. And it did not end in war. It ended in peace. And he said these words, Europe is now whole, free, and at peace. Putin is trying to make Europe divided, unfree, and in a state of constant war. And why should it matter to Bostonians and Americans? Europe's our largest trade partner, the largest investor in our economy and in our New England economy, and the largest number of American allies are in NATO. It really matters. And so this is for all the marbles. And, you know, I understand why President Trump wanted to give Putin a chance, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. Putin has snubbed him. It's time for our president to speak up about what happened in Poland, join the Europeans, lead NATO. We don't want to go to war with Russia. We want to deter Russia. Sanctions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Burns. Thank you, World Boston. My name is Lamin Savadogo. I want to push a little bit back on the question that you were asked about who is ahead. You know China more than most people. Some of your academic colleagues think that China has peaked. Some of them think that they are not impressed by the show in a couple of days ago.
Okay.
Could you talk to us about the underbelly? We talk about the Evergrande. We talk about the unsustainable debt at the provincial level, the infrastructure that looks very impressive, but that those trains are not really running well. That tofu drag, I'm sure you heard the expression.
Great.
Could you talk to us about the underbelly a little bit? Thank you.
What an
underbelly.
interesting question. It really, I mean, all the questions have been interesting. We could probably organize a course at Northeastern or Harvard or Boston College or BU on every question. If Libby were here, she's in the audience. I don't want to force her to come here and speak. There she is. Libby and I have been talking a lot over the last couple of months since we came home to Cambridge, Mass, to say, you know, what did we learn? What did we process? And certainly Libby thinks, and I agree with her, we've underestimated Chinese power in the world. Those trains are fabulous. We rode those trains. You know, you can go from Beijing to Shanghai in 4.5 hours. And that's, 1,000 kilometers. We have Amtrak's just not like that. If you read a sellout from Boston to New York. But the level of infrastructure, here's the strengths. The infrastructure, that's one strength. Second, their scientific and technological capacity. That's the coin of the realm in our decade, in the next few decades. Which society will turn out more scientists and engineers? Here's a data point. 34% of first-year students in Chinese universities study engineering or a STEM field. The United States of America, 5.6%. And they're a much bigger country. At Harvard graduation, where I teach, when we ask our graduate students to stand up as a class, chemistry majors, biology majors, physics majors, largely Asian Americans, some American citizens, Asians, American citizens of Asian ethnicity, or Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese. Last week, when President Trump gathered all the tech titans of the United States in the White House, tremendous number of those tech titans are Indian Americans and Chinese Americans or Taiwanese Americans. We're not competing when it really matters for the future, and that's on technology. So, and I think the PLA, some people have said, well, it hasn't fought since 1978. What it's worth? I've seen the PLA. I think we've underestimated their military strength, their technology strength, and one other thing. The Communist Party of China is strategic, and they don't have to worry about, we want to worry about what the press says. I mean, that's a good thing to have the press challenging the government. They have nobody opposing them. And so they can make big bets over 10, 20, 30 years. Mary and I were mentioning one of them. For 35 consecutive years, the Chinese foreign minister, whoever that person is, has made his first trip of the year in January to Africa to show the Africans, you are our priority. I think President Trump never went to Africa in his first term. President Biden went once to Angola for 2 or 3 days in December, just before he resigned. They're strategic, and we're not competing on that level. So actually, I think the Chinese and technology, military, economics are stronger than we think they are. And I think we've underestimated them, and we can't do that any longer. So that's my answer to your question. It's a complicated subject, but thank you for it.
So Tim down here. Hi, Tim.
So we believe as sort of a network that every person in this room, every person in this country is a citizen diplomat. As the government steps back from diplomatic engagement, what can we all do to fill in that space?
So, a lot of this conversation is about what divides us and how tough-minded we need to be. But we also need to be dedicated to a peaceful relationship. And I think part of that is a function of, can we keep the two societies meeting? And COVID really interrupted things. Data point, there were 5 million tourists that went back and forth between our two countries in 2019. And I think that number went down to something like 190,000 by 2022 because the Chinese government shut down China. We all quarantined. We quarantined 21 days on arrival, Libby and I. So we need to get tourism back. Students, we have a healthy number, unfortunately, of Chinese students in America. We had 15,000 American students 10 years ago in China. We went down to 350 by 2022. So I made it a major priority to work with Duke University, Stanford, Georgetown, Yale, UCLA, Berkeley, to try to get them to come back with their Mandarin language programs, come back with their junior year students, come back with their summer programs, because I had this huge advantage as ambassador. My embassy was filled with Americans, diplomats, and military officers who were fluent in Mandarin because they had it in grade school or college, and they had experience, 2 or 3 times experience of living in China. And if we keep going at the rate we are, we only have 1,104 students now, American students in all of China, then my successor 10 or 15 or 20 years ago is not going to have the bench I had. And, China is the other great society. So whether you're in business or academics or education or healthcare or government, we need Americans who speak the language, Mandarin, who've been there, who understand the other culture, if we're going to have a peaceful relationship. So funny story. My staff didn't know exactly how many students, American students we had a year ago today. So at a staff meeting, I said, call every Chinese university and ask them, how many Americans do you have? And the number came back about 6 weeks later, 1,104. In December, I went to Guizhou province, which is one of the poorest provinces, very beautiful place. In China, I went to Guizhou University. I met with the president, 40,000 students there. I said, Mr. President, I understand you don't have any American students. He said, we do. We've got 1 student. And he's right behind this curtain. And he called out this young man, 19-year-old, and I can use his name because he told me I could use his name, Jared Shelley from Berkeley, California. And I said, Jared, you're number 1,105. He had no idea what I was talking about. I said, we've upped the number by one. I said, how did you get here? It was fascinating. He said, 2 reasons. He said, my mom and dad are PhDs in Chinese studies from Berkeley. So in our household, you know, we talked about China, and my mom and dad were inspirations. He said, but the real reason was I had a girlfriend in his Sacramento, California high school from the Miao community. That's a minority community in China, and she was an immigrant to the United States. And he said, my Miao community girlfriend convinced me that Guizhou University was the center of the world and that I should go to college there. And I said, so are you still with her? He said, no, we broke up. But it was interesting because as Jared was talking to me, he kept breaking into Mandarin. I said, Jared, are there any other Americans here? He said, none, 40,000 students. He said, I'm living with 6 other Chinese guys. It's perfect. He said, I'd never speak English. And he was becoming fluent in Mandarin. We need more Jareds. Because that's the way to keep the peace between societies. Integration, cultural integration, the work that World Boston does in receiving Chinese visitors to this country. I walked through Harvard Yard today. Huge groups of Chinese tourists around the John Harvard statue. I thought, good. Because, you know, we can be hard line on the military, on human rights. The Chinese people are not our enemy. And we have to live in peace with them, and what better way than to understand them? So I think it's great that we have Mr. Xi here from Northeastern, from China, from Guangzhou, here at Northeastern. Can I just say that? Welcome.
David Leonard, Boston Public Library. So I get the last question. Welcome, Ambassador. I want to pull back out to the state of expertise in the federal agencies as a result of this radical change in policies. Because one of the ways to diagnose a problem is to ask yourself, how easy would it be to correct or put it back later? And so I'd love to get your take on the state of our diplomacy, state, and international relations capacity.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for maintaining this jewel, the Boston Public Library, for our city. You know, look, I spent a long time in government in both Republican and Democratic administrations. I would never say that government's perfect. And because we don't operate in the profit motive, and we don't have to even show a profit or a revenue stream, there's a lot of fat in government agencies. Not in every government agency, but in many, and I've seen it. And so I've really respected the secretaries of state. I've mentioned Condi Rice, Colin Powell, who launched a major reform effort. And sometimes you need fewer people. Sometimes you need to cut the budget. That's totally understandable. But the way we did it in January, February, and March was to bring a bunch of people in who didn't know government, and they were acting, you know, they just fired people en masse without interviewing them, without giving them a chance. These are 30 and 40-year veterans of our government. So what value do you bring to this agency? None of those questions were asked. They had quotas. You know, Secretary Rubio just fired 3,000, American diplomats. We're a very small service. We're about 15,000 people. That's small for government. There's 2.5 million people in the military. There are about 15,000 American diplomats. We just fired 3,000 of them. And they fired people. They said, we don't want to fire anybody overseas. And so we rotate back and forth from overseas to the State Department. They just picked 3,000 people in Washington, some of whom were just about to go overseas, and said, because you're here and we have a quota, you're all gone.